Right, well, thank you, Jan. Now, I don't do American accents. I don't do any accents but my own, so I'm afraid you'll have to live with that. Yes, I'm going to talk about It's Not Oil Gone. And those of you who took the trouble to read the abstract will know that what I'm trying to cover in 50 minutes is quite a large topic. Why does it matter that the oil isn't all gone? And then I'm going to talk about how we actually recover oil, because that will help us to understand why that oil isn't all gone. I'm going to review some of the techniques and technologies we use to recover oil at the moment, and some of the newer technologies that have come about in recent years. And then I'm going to talk about some of the practical issues that have to be dealt with to make the most of the oil that we have, because as it's noted up here, it's a finite resource and it will eventually run out, but not for a while yet. And then I'll finish with some closing words talking about where I think the opportunities and challenges are in the future. So why does it matter that it's not oil gone? Well, way back in 1956, King Hubbard, who was an American, probably a Texan, but I'll spare you my Texan accent, realized that because crude oil as we know it is formed from basically fossilized organic remains from many millennia ago, it will eventually run out. And he produced this plot, which has a typical kind of bell curve. And since then, whenever people look at how much oil there is left, they say, oh, it's going to run out. And I think when I was young and Jan was younger, possibly, even then, people were saying, oil's going to run out. And I suppose if I'd decided at age 12 to be a petroleum engineer rather than an astronaut, people said, oh, you'll never make it through to retirement with that as a career. You better find something else. An astronaut is a more stable future for you. So anyway, and then more recently, we've had publications by David King, who was formerly Chief Scientific Advisor to the government. And he's done an analysis here, which he published in Nature, so it must be right, that says that here is the production of oil since 1998 to 2011. Ignore the red line, it's just the price of oil. But he says here, well, here we've clearly hit a peak, and this is the end. Oil is about to run out. Along with that, we know that burning fossil fuels is a bad thing. It makes carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide contributes to climate change. And as we can see in the plot here, which is another very well-known plot, this is a measurement of atmospheric carbon dioxide in Hawaii and in the South Pole, that over many decades, the amount of carbon dioxide has been increasing in the atmosphere. Just for context, here's the Space Lab launch, which was when I was working with this Atmos project. So yes, you can work out when I was doing my PhD from that. So anyway, we look at oil's about to run out, we look at carbon dioxide increasing, time to retire. Sorry, Ann, I'm out of here. I'll be off now, and you can all go and have tea and cakes, and that's that. Or maybe not, as you can tell, because there's another 50 minutes of me talking to you. So let's think about the energy that we use today to understand why it's not time to retire yet. What we have here is a map of the number of vehicles per 1,000 people around the world, and this was produced by the World Bank. And you can see in America and Australia and in Europe we have loads of cars. And then we look at the rest of the world. Look at China. China is 20% of the world's population at the moment, and it's got very, very much fewer cars than the developed world. So all these people will want our lifestyle in the future, so they'll want the number of cars that we have. So clearly there's going to be a demand for something that fuels cars and transportation, and that's probably going to be oil. And that's supported by the analysis done by the World Energy Agency. Here we've got a plot of oil or energy that the world will need up until 2030 and the various sources of it. And the first two things to take away are that there's going to be about a 40% increase in energy demand between today and 2030, and that 25 to 30% of that is going to be supplied by oil. Yeah? And that is more oil in 2030 than today, although it's not increasing at such a high rate. So clearly it's important, and the World Energy Authority thinks we're not going to run out of oil. Why is there this growth in oil consumption? Well, basically, we've got the emerging economies. These are quotes directly from a fact sheet by the World Energy Authority. China, India, Middle East, loads of people, not many cars at the moment. And although in the West, we're going to be reducing our demand for oil, in the Middle East and Far East, there's going to be such an increase it will outweigh our demand. And it's not just us personally driving our cars, it's trucks transporting the goods around. And note that 50% of global oil consumption is already accounted for by transport, and the number of passenger cars is set to double out to 2030. So we need lots more oil, and yet it's a finite resource, and some people are saying it's about to run out. How are we going to find that oil? Where is it going to come from? Well, one option is new fields. That can be done, not from outer space, but there are still unexplored basins in the far-flung corners of the world, but they're very remote, and they are in environmentally sensitive areas. I mean, Al Fraser gave his inaugural a year or two ago. Are you around, Al? No. But he talked about basins that might contain oil in the Arctic. And the trouble with, there's apparently oil in the Antarctic. Both of these are very environmentally sensitive and precious areas. They have cute polar bears, when they're tiny at least, and lovely penguins, and they've got very special landscapes that perhaps we don't want to subject to oil exploration. So new fields is an option, and there is oil out there, but it's more difficult to get at. Heavy oil. Heavy oil is the really thick, gungy stuff that if you tipped a glass of it upside down, will take a few minutes to pour out of the glass. There's at least as much heavy oil in the world as there is remaining conventional oil to recover. So there's plenty of it. Trouble is, getting it out of the ground is rather unpleasant. If you look carefully, this is a photo from Canada. These are dirty, great big trucks. So this is an enormous hole in the ground where they've been mining the bitumen. And look at what it's done to the landscape in the tundra. In addition, you need to supply energy to get this heavy oil moving, and it's very energetically intensive to transport it and process it. There's a choice of oil shale, which is kind of source rock, which is where the oil originally came from, but it's not quite cooked enough yet. So there's plenty of that around, but we're still not quite sure how to recover it. So we could go for new fields, we could go for heavy oil, we could go for oil shale. But what about existing fields? The shocking fact is that the existing average recovery factor from oil fields around the world is 30 to 40%. And This gentleman's from Total. He was the SPE president, Society of Petroleum Engineers, in 2011. And he noted that increasing the average ultimate recovery factor from 35% to 40%, 45%, would bring about 1 trillion barrels of oil. That's about the same that a volume of oil that Huppert back in 1956 said actually existed in the whole world. And this is going to be the focus of the talk today. These existing fields, they've got infrastructure, they've got light oil that's easy to recover. What can we do to get from 35 to 45% recovery factor, or indeed 70%? Some fields, one or two, have managed a 70% recovery factor. But before we start, let's just think about where this oil is. There are some definitions that we need to understand. Obviously, oil companies are valued on how much oil they have. And there's a very particular definition, which is they're valued on their reserves, which are the volumes of oil that they can commercially recover and which they have plans in place to recover. So when we're talking about ultimate recovery factors, we're talking really about reserves. In actuality, there's a whole lot more oil underground than we're able to commercially recover, and these are called resources. And this cartoon, if you imagine that sort of greeny, creamy oval, that's the resources in a given field. Here are the reserves, and they're about 35–40% of this volume. And what's interesting is there's this light green oval here, which is bigger than the reserves, although not as big as the resources. And that's the volume of oil we could technically recover. So if you let some academics go out and play in an oil field and you didn't worry about money, then that's what we'd tell you we could get out of the ground. The trouble is, we want to actually make money, or oil companies want to make money. So the aim, initially at least, is to at least make those reserves as big as the technically recoverable volume. It would be lovely to make it as big as the resources, but let's not be too ambitious. So in order to understand how we can improve recovery, let's think about why recovery factor is as bad as we think it is. Most oil is recovered from reservoirs by injecting water into them. And when you inject water into a reservoir, so here's a little cartoon of a reservoir. The red stuff is the oil. Some people use green, but I like red. And here's an injection well. It's injecting water into the rock underground to push the oil out to the production well here. This separation is about 1 kilometre. But within the reservoir, it's solid rock, give or take, with little holes in between where we have oil and water mixed together. And when you inject water into the rock, how well it displaces the water out of the pores is what we call the pore scale displacement efficiency. Then when we inject the water, there are layers of rock and other geological features which which means that the water travels more quickly in some areas than others. And there are some areas, like I've drawn here, where oil is left behind. And that's poor macroscopic sweep efficiency. We have a factor called drainage efficiency, which is due to the fact that there are faults and other barriers to flow in the reservoir. So even if you inject the water, it can't get in here because this fault will stop the water going there. And then finally, and certainly not least, there are economic constraints. We want to make money out of it. So what I'm going to go through now is looking at each of these factors, pore scale, macroscopic, and economic, and see how we can make them better. So let's think about microscopic displacement efficiency. Between 10 and 30% of oil is trapped in pores. So what I've done here is a little cartoon. The yellow circles are sand grains. In reality, they're about 1 millimetre across. And in between the grains are the pores, which are the holes, and they're about 100 microns, 0.1 of a millimetre in diameter. If the grains of rock like water, then little blobs of oil will get left behind in the bigger pores. because the oil and the water don't mix, and it's a bit like a capillary tube. You get capillary forces snapping off the oil here. If you have oil-wet rock, then the oil gets just trapped in little films around the grains. I hope you can see there are little red circles there. And of course, in real life, the rock doesn't look like that. The rock looks like this big mess here, where the light grey is the rock itself, and we've got white and we've got black. This is actually a picture of water and carbon dioxide. But you can see the pores, and you can see that there are little ganglia of fluids trapped in those pores. So we get oil trapped because the fluids don't mix. We've got funny wettabilities, oil wet, water wet, something in between, and pore, complicated topology of the pore space. Macroscopic sweep, well, this is when we're looking on the interwell scale. We've got, say, as I said, about a kilometre between wells. And each well is basically a big tube, about that big. You know, it's about 30 centimetres in diameter. And they're metal tube, you make little holes in it, and when you inject fluid, the water comes out of the holes. So when you inject the water, it doesn't uniformly move through the volume of the reservoir. It will leave volumes of oil behind just because of the preferred flow pattern of the water through the reservoir. Water is heavier than oil as well, so it will tend to slump down and run along the bottom of the reservoir if it can, both of which reduce the volumetric sweep in the reservoir. Interestingly, and there's a photo for you, Matt, wherever you are, and most importantly, we get poor macroscopic sweep because we get permeability heterogeneity. This is where the geology comes out and bites us. The rocks and the reservoir look very much like the cliffs you see on holiday. They have areas of higher permeability rock and lower permeability rock. And these are drawn here. Yellow is good, black is bad, and there are different permeabilities here. So these are cross-sections from real sections of rock. Here's something that's about so big, and here's something that's a wee bit bigger. And here is a computer simulation of where the water might go if injected into these two rocks. And the pink is where, and the green is where the oil hasn't been swept, and the paler blue. And you can see we're getting a poor sweep because of this geological heterogeneity. So this is reducing our recovery factor further. So that's the academic view of why you don't get much oil out of the reservoir. Let's think about the sort of the practical commercial view. We're in the oil business to make money. At the end of the day, that's what oil companies are there for. We're there to make pounds for the shareholders, or if you're a national oil company, to repay the government. Building the infrastructure to recover that oil is actually hugely expensive. Shell's Perdido platform, $3 billion. I'll have a piece of that in my bank account. Why is it so expensive? Well, look at this picture here. Here we've got the seabed, and we've got, let's start here to give people on this side a chance. And here's the depth of the water. So down here is 2,400 meters. Yeah, so that's 2,400 meters depth of water. But underneath here somewhere is the oil reservoir. So to build an offshore platform, you have to build something big enough and stable enough that it'll go out and it'll sit stably in that depth of water. There's the Shard to scale. Yeah? So we're all terribly proud of the Shard. It's actually tiny compared with the sizes of these structures that we're dealing with. So no wonder they cost $3 billion. And obviously these have a finite size of deck space, and therefore they have to separate the oil that's produced from the water and the gas that comes out of the reservoir. And this equipment costs money, and the space on the platform costs money. And then there are other practical issues. If you have an oil field onshore in the middle of the desert, water is not an an easily obtainable resource in the middle of the desert. So even if you may want to do water flooding to get the most oil out of the ground, it may not be there. So you may not be able to afford to pipe that water in. So there are very real economic reasons why recovery factor isn't as high as it could be. Then the final consideration is risk. If you're investing $3 billion, you want to be pretty damn sure you're going to get your money back at the end of the day. As I mentioned before, oil fields are geologically complex. They have different permeabilities, and water will flow through those different permeabilities in different ways. I mean, here we've got millimeter to centimeter scale heterogeneity, all the way up to, you can see here in this cliff face, that's a couple of hundred meters of different layers that you can see there. So you've got this heterogeneity. And the trouble is, oil fields are very big, and we don't know very much about them. Forties, we possibly remember, is a field in the middle of the North Sea, just here. But for illustration, I've superimposed it on top of London. So here's a street map of London, taken from Google Maps. That little red dot there, if you can see it here on this side, there's an A. That's where Imperial College is. So you can see all the road network. There's the Thames, there's Waterloo Station for scale. Forties has about 150 wells in it last time I read about it. Each of those wells is so big, they're usually vertical. The only information you really have about the reservoir is at those wells. And you're trying to map the road network, if you like, in that oil field using information from basically standing at 150 lampposts around London. Yeah? So you're pretty uncertain where those roads go. So when you're trying to develop an oil field, you're trying to understand how we can make something that's robust to whether the, I can't see where the M3 goes, but the A316, possibly that one there. See whether it goes that way or in some other way. So you have to take into account that uncertainty and risk. So what can we do to improve recovery factor? We use something called enhanced oil recovery to get this recovery factor above the 35–40%. And there are various technical ways that we can deal with improving particularly pore scale displacement efficiency and macroscopic sweep efficiency. The majority of these methods, scarily enough, date back to the 1970s and the 1980s. The focus then was particularly on improving the pore scale displacement efficiency, making sure there was as little oil as possible trapped in the pore space in between the little grains of rock. And the best way of doing that, people decided, was to reduce interfacial tension. It was to make the oil and the water, or the displacing fluid, mix together, so you don't get this trapped oil in the pores or sticking closely to the grains of rock. And what you do is, instead of injecting water, you inject gas, which mixes very well with the oil. So that's can be hydrocarbon gas. It could be carbon dioxide if you have that to hand. Or if you don't have any gas, perhaps you want to sell it and make money for some reason, then you might add some chemicals to the water that you inject. A surface active agent, surfactant. You know, it's the same kind of concept. You add washing up liquid to water to get the oil off your dishes. So oil companies think about adding surfactants. Not your fairy, I hasten to add. It's a bit hotter and a bit more difficult underground, but same concept. And the aim is to reduce the oil trapped in the pore space, so you get, when you inject the water or the gas, there's no little red blobs lying around there. That's all well and lovely. It works beautifully when you do it in the lab in your little lab experiments, but it's a bit trickier when you try and do it on the larger scale. Because the trouble with gas, of course, is it's much less viscous than the oil. If it can find a way through to the production well, it's going there. forget the fact you want to get more oil out, it's going to where it can get back out of the reservoir. If there's no geology in there to speak of, then you get this unstable viscous fingering. If you inject slowly, fairly slowly, then of course gas is much lighter than oil, so it'll tend to ride over the oil and form a gravity tongue. Both these cases, you can see you're going to reduce your macroscopic sweep efficiency. There's going to be oil bypassed. And last and by no means least, if you have an adverse viscosity ratio, which is what happens when you inject gas or when you add surfactants to water, that makes life worse as well, then any permeability variations that you have, it will be easier for the gas to sneak through to the production well again. And then the cartoon I haven't drawn here because I couldn't quite think how to draw it was if you're injecting surfactants. Surfactants are active chemicals. There are clays and there are other chemicals, other compounds in the rock, and their ambition in life is to get very friendly with the surfactants, and so you will lose the surfactant to the adsorption onto the rock surface, and then you won't get the reduction in interfacial tension you were looking for. So basically, you can improve pore-scale displacement efficiency, but you can't improve, or you have problems with macroscopic sweep with these conventional, if I can say it, enhanced oil recovery methods, the older ones. So instead, what do you do? Well, you can try and make make it more difficult for the gas. You make life more difficult for the gas by adding water along with the gas, and then that makes it more difficult for the gas to go through the pores because there's water in the way, and that's called water alternating gas. And there's a cartoon here where we've got, this is the gas, this is the water that's been injected simultaneously with the gas. You can see that the fingering here is much less. So we've improved our macroscopic sweep. If you're dealing with a surfactant that reduces the interfacial tension between the water and the oil, then you can add a polymer, and a polymer makes the water thicker. So again, you're making it more difficult for the water to bypass the oil. And to reduce chemical loss, you can add alkali, again, to the surfactant to try and make it more difficult for it to be adsorbed onto the rock surface, and maybe reduce the volume of fluids that you need by adding water. Because remember, we're talking about reservoirs here that might contain 100 million or more barrels of oil. So you're going to, in order to displace all that oil, you need many tens of millions of barrels of whatever it is you're injecting. So if you're adding chemicals to that, that's an awful lot of chemicals actually, probably a chemical plant's worth of production for a year or so. A slightly more subtle approach is if you've got these high permeability layers. This is a cross-section through a reservoir. There's a high permeability layer. And if you inject water, then it'll tend to zip through that layer there. So why not put in a gel plug? If you put in a chemical mixture that will set solid in the pore space, then when you inject the water, it can't go through there because it's all plugged up with the gel. So you then get better sweep efficiency. So those are some of the older methods for improving oil recovery. The technical challenge, of course, is still we don't know what the heterogeneity is in the reservoir. We've seen that these EOR methods are very sensitive to geological heterogeneity. Technically, we can try and deal with that, but we need to know what's underground, and we don't. We have to take into account the uncertainty. And then the other technical challenge, which makes it quite difficult for engineers, is that EOR processes are actually very complicated to design. I mean, I've thrown up an equation here. If you are doing miscible gas injection, then you're worrying about the phase behavior of the gas and the oil. And you have to start dealing with nasty-looking equations like this. This is the ideal gas law. but it's not ideal anymore. It's dealing with the pressure, temperature, and volume behavior in a real hydrocarbon. So engineers need to become very skilled in the use of thermodynamics or in chemistry if they're looking at alkali surfactant polymer behavior. Another challenge that we have is that enhanced oil recovery actually works best if you haven't injected water first. And that's a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? Because we've just been saying we've got 40% recovery factor from our oil reservoirs where we've injected water. And yet we should have, if we'd known 20 years ago, we should have put gas in there. We should have put our surfactants in straight away. So now we've got to deal with these water-flooded reservoirs. What I've plotted here, which I've stolen from a BP paper, so I hope they'll forgive me, they've taken some data from an oil field in the North Sea called Ula. Here's the oil rate versus time. This is the oil production rate. Here you've got the water injection rate in the solid blue and the water production rate. So you can see how much water is being produced compared with how little oil. And this is an operational field. There's a saying that there's more water produced from oil fields in the North Sea than Perrier produces from, water mines or whatever. And here's the gas that's coming out. There's the gas injection in solid red, and here these dots are the gas production. So Ula was originally produced under water flood, and here's all along here. And then about, 2000-ish, BP decided they were going to inject gas and water together to try and improve the oil recovery. So that happened just here, where it says WAG starts. Can you see that there's absolutely no change in oil recovery at that point? There's maybe a little blip here where it starts, you get a small increase, and you certainly aren't getting the decrease in oil recovery, but it's a very small response. Yeah, and it's taken several years to get that response. And that's the trouble when you're trying to persuade people to invest in EOR, that its response is slow, particularly in a reservoir that's been water flooded. It's difficult to identify whether you've actually improved the recovery. Someone else might say, oh, we drilled another well then. It wasn't your silly old WAG process, it was us drilling engineers solving the problem for you. So you have to look very carefully to see if EOR is doing its job. And all along you're dealing with this high water production and eventually high gas production if you're injecting gas into the reservoir. And if you've got gas and oil production, gas and water production alongside your oil, you have to have ways of separating it out, because you don't want to have water and gas going along to the refinery along with your oil, and you certainly don't want water in your petrol tank. Okay, so those are some of the technical challenges you have to deal with. There's some very practical challenges. Oil fields, as I said, are in very remote corners of the world. We've got, there's a pipeline going through Egypt, basically nothing there. There's a Total floating production facility in Angola, so there's a ship, and there's the pipework going to the sea floor, and then the oil reservoir is down here, so that's in the middle of the deep ocean. Here's Prudhoe Bay in Alaska. If you watch Ice Road Truckers, Tim, that's where you're going. So that's right up there in the Arctic. These are very remote corners of the world. You want to get exotic chemicals up there, it's going to be costly and maybe impossible to actually get those up there. If you want to inject gas into your reservoir, gas is actually quite a valuable commodity. It's only worth re-injecting it into your reservoir if you're a long way away from anywhere, like in Prudhoe Bay, or there's plenty of gas on the market already. There are challenges with actually operating some of these EOR processes. If you imagine you're in the platform in the middle of the North Sea, someone actually has to move the equipment to stop injecting gas and start injecting water, and then reverse that in a few days or a month's time. So actually managing that when there are lots of other jobs to do on a platform is quite tricky. If you're going to do EOR, you're actually retrofitting equipment very often. This is a platform, I'm not sure where it is, but you can see all the equipment that's put on this offshore platform. And actually, if you want to do EOR and add extra equipment, there ain't a lot of space there, is there? So that's another difficulty. If you're doing EOR, where are you going to put the extra pumps, the separators, whatever? Where are you going to dump the produced fluids? If you're putting surfactants and polymers into the reservoir, they're going to come out at some point. That's the law of reservoir engineering, and you don't want to just drop them into the middle of the North Sea or into the Gulf of Mexico. You will be really, really unpopular. So there has to be a way of cleaning up the water that comes out of the reservoir. And as I mentioned, just getting stuff to these remote locations, I mean, it makes a good program, ice road truckers, but it's really not really difficult to get this stuff there. All right, so it's expensive and complex to operate EOR. There's also issues with safety and the environment. You really have to operate this very carefully. The cartoon, there are two whales. They're looking at these happy people here. I wanted to tell them how to cap the oil well, but they just kept rolling me back in the water. So sometimes the whales are trying to tell us something. But making sure that oil companies operate in a safe way is one of the challenges with any part of recovering oil. There are decisions that people make regarding EOR that depend on whether you're a national or an independent oil company, because you report to different people. National oil companies worry about safeguarding the resource for the future, so it's no surprise that in China, where they have a national oil company or two, they have gone for EOR processes for many, many years. They do polymer injection, they do microbial enhanced oil recovery injection, and they've done it not because it's immediate, they're going to get an immediate commercial return, but it's their way of husbanding their nation's resources. Independent oil companies report to their shareholders, and their shareholders want a return fairly quickly. So you have to be very sure that you're going to get payback on your reservoir. And maybe EOR, with its slow response, isn't always the most commercially attractive way of doing that. And then there's some political considerations why EOR perhaps isn't applied as often as it might do. Oil companies don't own oil fields most of the time. They lease it, or they get given a license to operate by the nation that owns the ground, and then they will sign an agreement with that country. And that agreement is often a production sharing agreement whereby the oil companies do the work, they invest the money, and therefore the country then agrees to pay back the cost of that investment, and they will get 20% of the profits thereafter. And often that agreement is only for 10 years. So if you're an independent oil company and you've got one of these production sharing agreements, it's going to cost you more money to get to do EOR. So maybe it's not worth it, particularly if you've only got 10 years in which to make your money, given how long it takes to really get the benefit out of EOR, and particularly when you're only getting 20% of the profit. So sometimes these production sharing agreements mean that EOR is a less attractive option. I should point out that independent oil companies sometimes invest or will do more advanced EOR techniques than national oil companies because they have the resources to invest in it, and it's a way of differentiating themselves from their competition when they're competing for this license to operate. All right, so we've got conventional EOR, which it can get some oil out of the ground, but there are a number of difficulties with applying it. Are there any new technologies? Well, there are two technologies which have come to light in the last 10 or 15 years. Back in 1999, the University of Wyoming spotted that if you change the composition of the water that you inject into a reservoir, then you actually can improve the recovery. And in particular, if you look here, this is an oil recovery against volume of brine injected. This is the recovery you get with a brine that's got 2% calcium chloride. And this is the recovery you get in the same piece of rock with the same oil, but if you reduce the calcium chloride in that brine. So that was the foundation of the low salinity water injection scheme that BP have proposed and is becoming, there's a great deal of excitement throughout the oil industry there. And it's followed on by some results by the University of Stavanger, where they found that if you change the sulfate composition in water, you're going to improve the recovery here. So both of these discoveries, which are back in the, well, this was actually discovered in the early 21st century, these shown that we could improve pore scale displacement efficiency by changing wettability. Yeah, that's basically what these compositions are doing. They're changing the rock wettability. And they've shown us that there may be more that can be done if we change the water composition. And the real benefit of these processes is they're much easier to operate than conventional EOR. You just need to alter the water composition with reverse osmosis or some other technique. And if you compare that with re-injecting gas, which you then have to separate out, injecting chemicals, you're already set up to inject water. So most of the equipment you have, you know how to manage. And then the other advantage of using water is that, okay, you have the problem that water and oil don't mix very well, but you do get a reduced volume of oil trapped in the pore space. But you also get the benefits of a water flood, where a water flood actually helps to mitigate against the viscosity ratio between the water and oil because of its characteristics. So there's a lot of promise in this opportunity to change water composition slightly and improve oil recovery. I mean, here you're talking about 10-15% improvement in oil recovery in a core, not a reservoir. Other technologies that are being discussed are deep reservoir flow diversion. We talked about setting gels in high permeability layers near an injector well. Those aren't actually very efficient because sometimes when you block up this high permeability layer, the water will find its way around. It's pretty sneaky water. As you'll know, if you have a leak in your roof and you try and fix it, the water will find another way through. If you don't fix that leak, the water will be there. And it's kind of the same in reservoirs. If it can find a way of making the reservoir engineer's life difficult, it'll find it. But by being very clever and designing a chemical that doesn't set until it's far into the reservoir, as shown here, you can actually stop the water bypassing too much of the oil in the lower permeability layers and improve your recovery. And the benefit of these sort of techniques is that you don't actually need to know very much about the heterogeneity in the reservoir. The water will, first of all, take your chemicals into the bad, the high permeability zones, and then it'll get hot. In the case of bright water or in foams, they'll start blocking up the pore space, and they will automatically divert the water around them. So these are quite neat ideas, and there are probably opportunities to work further in these sort of areas. Then there's some old technologies which have been around for a while, and maybe it's time to go back to them. Believe it or not, there are microbes that live underground in the reservoir. You know, some of them have been there for millions of years. There aren't many of them, and they're not doing very much because there's not a lot to eat. But back in 1946, Zobel patented a bacteriological process for the treatment of fluid-bearing earth formations. Feed the bugs, they'll grow, they make surfactants, they'll block the high permeability pores, and you'll get more oil out. This hasn't been widely applied because until recently we didn't know much about microbiology and how to manage microbes and how they work. With the recent renaissance of microbiology and understanding of what drives microbes, maybe it's time to go back and look at the MEOR process and see if we can make it work. Out of interest, that's a photograph that a PhD student took in, I think they were in Mississippi, and these little hairy bits are the microbes, and this is a grain of rock. So you're looking at something that's 10 microns across here. The other technology we might go back to, because with climate change we have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so people are proposing we should separate it at power stations and re-inject it underground. And then we could use it both to improve oil recovery and keep that CO2 out of the atmosphere. I mean, the challenges to address then are these issues to do with macroscopic sweep efficiency. If we inject CO2, we need to stop it being produced again. So the challenges for the future, as far as I can see, are to maximize carbon storage and oil recovery. We ought to be able to do it. We just need to think carefully. Find out where is the remaining oil. I mean, I've shown you some cartoons. We don't actually know in many reservoirs exactly how much of the oil is trapped in the pore space and where it is in the different length scales of geological heterogeneity. If we know where it is, then we can get it out. We need methods of dealing with uncertainty in geological heterogeneity, or we need to find processes like the sort of the bright water, the foams, that are less sensitive to heterogeneity, so we don't need to know about that, worry about the uncertainty. A big challenge is how to move things quickly out from the laboratory into the field. You've seen that the low salinity water was discovered back in 1999, a little bit earlier possibly, and I think it's only now that BP are putting it out in Clare, is that right, Pete? So that's 14, 15 years it's taken to have the confidence to take a laboratory observation and actually use it in the field. And then a big challenge, if you think of the North Sea, we've been producing oil there for 30, 40 years, is that those platforms were put out there 20, 30, 40 years ago. They were designed with a 20-year lifespan. They're getting a smidgen rusty out there by now, I expect. They're a little bit old. But we want to keep using them, particularly if we want to use any new or existing EOR processes. So there's going to be some mechanical engineering that needs to be done to keep these platforms going for the future. But the challenge is there. I mean, here is another graph. This is by some authors looking at and analysing how much, where the oil that we need in the future is going to come from. And they've broken it down by categories. Here are currently producing fields. Here's today, here's 2030. So you can see current fields, oil production is going to decline. Here are the new fields we're going to discover. There are going to be less of them. And we're going to discover a few more that we haven't yet found, so that's good. We've got opportunity of using natural gas liquids. Here are the heavy oils and bitumens. And look, this is all that they're forecasting for EOR. Yeah? Here is EOR today. It's a hair's breadth in thickness, isn't it, which is really pathetic when you think about it. And even out in 2030, they're only attributing 10%, maybe less of all our oil production to EOR. And yet there are all those technologies out there that, if we could make them work, would save us having to use these unconventionals and would maybe make good the decline in fields to be found. So to conclude, it's not oil gone. There's lots of oil out there. It's conventional oil. It's not the black, sticky, gungy stuff that heavy oil people will talk about. And we have got technologies to get that oil out of the ground, but we've got to make them economic. And the challenges are to get that oil out faster, make sure our platforms survive another 20, 30, 40 years, and deal with remote locations and how we're going to make huge volumes of chemicals. Other challenges are risk, how are we going to deal with geological uncertainty, and then perhaps it's a management of R&D. How do we get those new technologies to be deployed in 2 years or 5 years rather than 15 years? And last but not least, there is a significant challenge with climate change. Oil is necessary to provide energy, and the world needs that energy, but burning oil will add CO2 to the atmosphere and will cause climate change. So maybe we can make a benefit out of a necessity and sequester some of that carbon dioxide in oil reservoirs. Thank you.